My name is Brian Holloway. I'm 57 years old. I spent 31 years as a licensed electrician in Ontario, commercial, residential, and the last 12 years mostly institutional, schools, retirement residences, long-term care facilities. In that trade, you learn to read a system before you put your hands anywhere near it. You look at what's drawing power, what's running at capacity, what's already warm when it shouldn't be. An overloaded circuit doesn't announce itself. It just runs hotter and hotter, until one day it doesn't. I did not expect to need that skill at my daughter-in-law's Christmas dinner, but that is exactly where I needed it. Before I go any further, I want you to understand who Jean is. She spent 26 years as a personal support worker at Meadowbrook Gardens, a long-term care home about 20 minutes north of where we live. 26 years in that building with residents who were often past the point of having many visitors, whose families had thinned out or moved away, who relied on the people in that hallway for everything. Jean knew every one of them by name. She remembered which ones didn't like the overhead lights at bath time, which ones lit up when someone put Glenn Miller on the radio, which ones needed 5 extra minutes in the morning, just to feel ready to face the day. She is the most capable person I have ever known, and she is also, and I say this with full awareness of what it cost her, someone who spent most of her working life filling in the space that other people left empty. If this is your first time here, take a moment and hit like and subscribe, and drop your city and what time it is there in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the December I realized my daughter-in-law had made a very serious miscalculation. Scott is our son. He's 31. He works as a logistics coordinator at a distribution company out in Mississauga. His whole job is tracking what goes where and when. He grew up careful and thorough, the kind of kid who double-checked his math without being asked. I'm proud of him the particular way you're proud of a son who turned out to be a genuinely decent man. Scott met Amanda 2.5 years ago and married her 14 months after that. A December wedding in Oakville, hotel ballroom, white roses, string quartet. Jean spent 3 evenings the week before hemming the tablecloths Amanda had ordered online. She did it at the kitchen table after supper, with the sewing kit she'd had since her mother passed. I offered to help. Jean said she had it. That was Jean. I liked Amanda well enough at the start. She's sharp, organized, confident about her opinions. She works as a corporate event coordinator downtown. Her whole job is managing vendors, tracking budgets, making sure nothing falls through. Those aren't bad qualities. The issue, and it took me longer than it should have to name it, was that Amanda had a particular way of expressing what she needed. There was never really a question mark, just an assumption, already in motion, already dressed and waiting. The pattern started small, they always do. Scott and Amanda's housewarming, about 8 months into the marriage. Jean got a text from Amanda on a Tuesday. "Hey Mom, we're so excited about Saturday. Any chance you could bring your butter tarts? Everyone always raves about them. No, would you mind?" No, only if it's not too much trouble. Just the expectation, settled and certain. Jean made the butter tarts. She also made a loaf of lemon poppy seed bread because she'd heard Amanda mention once that she liked it. She put both in a tin with parchment paper between the layers. Nobody said anything specific about them at the party. Amanda posted a photo of the spread to Instagram, labeled as a homemade spread, no further detail. 4 months after that, Scott texted me on a Thursday. "Hey Dad, is it okay if Maple stays with you and Mom while we're in Puerto Vallarta? We leave Sunday." Maple was their cat, a gray tabby with, in my experience, no particular feelings about me one way or another. I said of course, but it was Thursday and they were leaving Sunday, and we hadn't heard a word until then. I brought it up with John that evening. She shrugged, said it was fine. I said it wasn't about whether it was fine, it was about how she was being asked. Jean gave me the patient look, the one that meant I know, Brian, but let's not make it a thing. I let it go. That was my mistake. I should have said something then. Not to cause a scene, not to start a fight, just to name it while it was still small. Instead, I let it run. That's on me. 6 weeks before Christmas, I was in the basement sorting through some wire fittings I'd been meaning to organize since spring when Jean came downstairs holding her phone. She didn't say anything, she just held it out. I read it standing there under the work light. It was a list. Tourtière from scratch, enough for 28, butter tarts 3 dozen, shortbread, 2 tins, Christmas pudding with brandy sauce, glazed carrots and parsnips, scalloped potatoes, green bean casserole, honey-baked ham, full size, Roasted Brussels sprouts, cranberry sauce, fresh, not canned, a charcuterie board for arrivals, a proper trifle for dessert, 12 items. Below the list, 28 confirmed, start time 6 a.m. Christmas morning, kitchen is all yours, Mom. I read that last line twice, kitchen is all yours, not our kitchen, not would you mind, just a colon and a smiley face after the address of a job site. I looked at Jean. She was standing with her arms crossed, very still, not angry yet, just deciding whether it was as bad as it looked. It was as bad as it looked. I'll call Scott, I said. She shook her head. Let me try first. She typed back, that's a lot for one person. Maybe we could order some things from the bakery on Queen Street, or split some of the cooking. Amanda's reply came in under 2 minutes. Mom, you're literally the best at this. We'll be running around with decorating and last-minute stuff. You've totally got it. Jean read it, set the phone face down on the workbench, and went back upstairs. 2 Sundays before Christmas, Scott had the family over for a casual dinner. Swiss chalet pickup, a bag of salad from the grocery store, nothing Amanda had cooked herself. I'll give her this. She never pretended to be something she wasn't in the kitchen. The performance was reserved for other areas. After dinner, while Scott was clearing the containers, Jean turned to Amanda. Said she'd been thinking about Christmas, that maybe Amanda's sister Jess could bring a couple of the sides, or they could order the tourtière from the French bakery on Queen Street that did a good one. Amanda laughed. It was a particular kind of laugh, warm on top, settled underneath. She reached over and touched Jean's hand. Mom, this is literally what you're good at. Everyone's going to love it. Don't overthink it. Jess nodded from across the table. Scott looked at the table. I watched my son look at that table and say nothing, not one word. On the drive home, I said, that is not happening. Jean was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know, I already have a plan. That night, after the 11 o'clock news, Jean called Wendy. Wendy had been her closest friend since they trained together as PSWs in the mid-90s, 2 young women in the same cohort at the same college, carrying the same heavy work in the same quiet hallways. Wendy retired 3 years ago and moved to Victoria with her husband Dave. They talked every Sunday morning. I sat in the kitchen while Jean was on the phone in the bedroom, and when she came out 25 minutes later, something in her face had settled. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and put both hands flat on the surface. Wendy invited us for Christmas, she said, her back deck. Dave's doing Dungeness crab, just the 4 of us. I said, I'm in. She looked at me, just like that. Jean, I folded my hands. Our daughter-in-law sent you a work order for a 12-item catering job. Our son watched her do it and ate his Swiss chalet and said nothing. Wendy is offering you fresh crab on a porch in Victoria. I paused. I'm not sure what the decision is exactly. She exhaled, long and slow, like something had been held in for weeks. She pulled a notepad across the table, wrote 4 lines, folded it, and set it by her mug. Then she opened her laptop. I watched her pull up Air Canada. December 24th departure, Pearson to Vancouver, connecting through to Victoria. 7:10 in the morning, 2 seats. She looked up at me. I nodded once. She pressed confirm. The texts kept arriving through the following weeks. Hey Mom, shortbread has to be homemade. Store-bought always tastes like cardboard Lowell. 3 days later, tourtière from scratch. I found an amazing recipe if you need it. The Friday after that, one more thing, could you do a proper Christmas pudding? Keith's wife grew up in England, so it would be such a nice touch. I asked Jean who Keith was. Amanda's regional manager, she said. I sat with that for a moment. This Christmas dinner, 12 items, 28 guests, a 6 a.m. start, was not a family gathering. It was a professional showcase. Amanda wanted to impress her boss, and she had decided that Jean's hands would be the instrument she used to do it. Each text arrived without a please and with total certainty. Jean replied to each one with a single word, okay. I asked her once whether that was wise. She said, I'm not stringing her along. I'm just not arguing with someone who isn't going to listen. 31 years in a trade will teach you something about load. You learn when a system is running at capacity and when it's already past it. I had been watching this circuit for 2 years. It had been warm for a long time. 4 days before Christmas, Jean drove over to Scott and Amanda's to return a casserole dish she'd borrowed. The door was unlocked. She stepped in to leave it in the kitchen, and she heard Amanda upstairs, on the phone. My mother-in-law is handling all the food. She spent 26 years as a PSW, so she's incredibly organized. She honestly just does it, you know? Keith is going to love it. It's going to feel so warm and homey. Way better than hiring a caterer. Jean came home and sat at the kitchen table without taking her coat off. A long moment of nothing. Then she looked at me. She doesn't think we'll actually go, Jean said. She thinks I'll show up at 6 in the morning because I always have. I said. Then Christmas is going to be very educational for her. Now, before I tell you what happened Christmas morning, I want to ask you something. Have you ever told someone something important and watched them decide not to hear it? If you know that feeling, drop a word in the comments. I read everyone. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment, because what comes next is the part nobody saw coming. In electrical work, there's a term we use: nuisance tripping. It's when a breaker keeps cutting out not because of a fault in the wiring, but because someone keeps adding load to a circuit that was already running at capacity. The solution isn't to keep resetting the breaker, it's to identify the source of the overload and remove it. That's not a dramatic action. It's just the correct one. 2 nights before Christmas, I called Scott. Jean had asked me not to. She'd already spoken to him and nothing had changed. But I am his father. And there are things a man needs to hear from his father, especially when he spent too long pretending not to know something he already knows. Scott picked up on the second ring. I kept it short. Your mother has a 12-dish list, 28 people. 6 in the morning, no help. She told you it was too much. You said nothing. I need you to fix that. A pause. Dad, I know, but Mandy's already got everything organized. Scott. It's just this one time. I recognized those words. They had the sound of something borrowed, rehearsed, preloaded, not his own. I said, I'm telling you clearly, your mother is not the catering staff for your wife's work event. Sort it out. Dad, I really think you're... I love you, I said. Good night. I hung up and came back to the living room. Jean looked up from her book and read my face without asking. He's not ready to hear it, she said. He will be. She set the book down, went to the hall closet, came back with her travel bag, and started to pack. I watched her for a moment, then went to get mine. I want to tell you about a thing I noticed that night while Jean was folding her clothes into that bag. Jean has an apron, dark green, heavyweight canvas, from the kitchen supply store in Guelph where we'd stopped on a drive years back. I gave it to her for her birthday, because she'd mentioned wanting one with proper deep pockets. There's a rust-colored stain near the hem from a Christmas past, when the oven rack slipped while she was pulling a roasting pan. She never got around to soaking it out. It hung on the hook inside the pantry door. I stood in the kitchen and thought about every Christmas in that room. Jean ran the operation. I was the one who handed her things and kept her company, and made sure she was never in there alone for 6 hours. I could not debone a bird to any standard she would recognize, but I could stand beside her for the whole of it and make her laugh and make sure she knew the food she put on that table had someone next to her while she made it. That was the thing Amanda had never understood. It wasn't about the labor, it was about the company, about not being used. I folded the apron along its old creases and left it on the hook. It didn't need to come to Victoria. Jean had already written the note, 4 sentences on a piece of paper torn from the notepad on the fridge, folded once. She set it on the kitchen table and weighted it down with the ceramic mug from the Niagara Falls gift shop we'd bought on a summer day trip years ago, painted with a waterfall, chipped slightly on the handle. Scott, we love you, but I cannot cook Christmas dinner for 28 people alone. I said so and no one heard me. We're spending Christmas with Wendy and Dave in Victoria, back on the 27th. The kitchen is yours. Mom and Dad. She'd added, and Dad at the bottom in different ink. I hadn't asked her to. We called an Uber at 4:15 Christmas Eve morning. The driver had a jazz station playing low and the heat turned up, and Jean sat beside me in the back seat with her hands in her lap. The particular stillness of a person who has made a decision and is now simply letting it happen. Pearson at 4:45 in the morning has a suspended quality, quiet in a way airports almost never manage. I bought us both coffees from the Tim Hortons in the terminal. Jean's phone had 2 unread texts from Amanda sent the night before. Reminders, cheerful emoji. We didn't open them. At 6:40, they called our boarding group. As we stepped into the jetway, my phone buzzed. A text from Scott. Hey Dad, swinging by with Mandy around 8 to pick you and Mom up. She wants Mom there by 9 to start. See you soon. He didn't know yet. I put the phone in my jacket pocket. We found our seats, 18A and 18B. Jean took the window. The plane pushed back at 7:14. When the wheels left the runway, Jean reached over and put her hand on mine. We didn't say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. Wendy and Dave met us at Victoria International with real coffee in paper cups and no dramatic reaction whatsoever, which is exactly what you want from someone who has known you for nearly 30 years. Wendy hugged Jean first. Then she looked at me. Brian, you actually came. Did you think I wouldn't? I thought Jean might talk you out of it somewhere over the Rockies. Jean said, I tried once. We drove into Victoria with the windows slightly down. 7 degrees, no snow, everything green in a way that Ontario in December makes you forget is possible. It smelled like salt and cedar and something blooming I couldn't name. After 30-odd years of January driving with sand and salt grinding in the wheel wells, it felt like a different country with better weather. Wendy's house was a small craftsman-style place near the water, pots of hardy geraniums still going on the front steps, a Japanese maple in the yard doing something complicated and beautiful. We took our coffees to the back deck. The inlet caught the afternoon light in long flat pieces. A great blue heron stood on a dock post across the water, perfectly motionless, with the authority of something that has never once been asked to justify its stillness. Jean's phone lit up on the table. I turned it face down. By noon it had buzzed 11 times. We ate Dungeness crab on the back deck in the mild December air. Wendy made a winter salad, roasted potatoes with rosemary, a bottle of Okanagan White that was considerably better than its price had any right to suggest. The heron eventually lifted from the dock post and disappeared somewhere across the water. At 3:17 in the afternoon, Jean's phone rang. Amanda. Jean looked at it, then at me, then at Wendy. Wendy looked at her crab. Jean picked up. The voice on the other end was a register higher than usual, tight at the edges. Do you know what's happening here right now? Keith arrives in less than 2 hours and there is nothing ready. Nothing. You could have at least called Mom. You could have... Jean set her fork down. She looked out at the water. Amanda, she said, and I recognized the tone from years of overhearing her on the phone with difficult families at Meadowbrook. Clear, unhurried, finished negotiating. I told you 6 weeks ago I couldn't do this alone. I said it again at Sunday dinner. Brian called Scott directly. Nobody heard us. A pause. So we made other plans. A silence. That is so selfish. We'll be home on the 27th, Jean said. I hope the rest of your evening goes well. She hung up. Dave refilled her wineglass without being asked. Wendy looked at the inlet. 22 minutes later, my phone rang. Scott. He didn't speak right away. I could hear him outside, the muffled sound of voices through a closed door, then quiet, then just whined, then nothing. Dad. His voice was different. Whatever surface had been holding everything smooth was gone. What was underneath was quieter and less composed. I don't know what to say. I knew it was too much. I kept telling myself it would work out, that you'd both just show up and it'd be fine, and I said nothing when I should have. I knew and I didn't say it. He stopped. I'm sorry, Dad. Tell Mom I'm sorry. I believed him. Scott had never been dishonest with me. What he'd done wasn't dishonesty. It was the particular failure of a man who kept choosing the easier path until the path ran out. That's different from bad character. And I had made the same failure myself earlier in this story, so I wasn't about to deliver a speech. I know, I said. We'll talk when we're home. Go take care of your guests. How is it there? I looked at what was in front of me, the crab, Wendy's roasted vegetables, a glass of the Okanagan White. Jean across from me, finally relaxed for the first time in 6 weeks, watching that heron stand motionless on its post over the water. It's wonderful, I said. Wendy made crab. A pause. Good. He steadied himself. Good, Dad. Go, I said. We'll see you on the 27th. I learned what happened at Scott's house from him in pieces. He'd gone to Costco at 8:30 that morning, after getting no answer from our phones. The Christmas party trays were mostly picked over. He grabbed a pre-cooked turkey breast roast from the prepared food section, 2 dozen pre-made pierogies, a full-sized shepherd's pie, a brie wheel with crackers, and 2 boxes of assorted Nanaimo bars and date squares from the bakery section, because he remembered at the last moment that Amanda had mentioned a dessert board. Amanda's sister Jess had attempted the tourtière from a YouTube tutorial, She burned the bottom crust. The kitchen smelled like scorched pastry for the rest of the afternoon. Nobody addressed it directly. Keith and his wife arrived at 4 p.m. exactly. The punctuality of people who have calculated precisely how long they intend to stay. Keith wore a blazer. His wife brought a bottle of wine. She had apparently been looking forward to the Christmas pudding Amanda had mentioned. Amanda told her there had been a last-minute change of plans. The table looked genuinely beautiful. Amanda had a real eye for a room. The linen, the candles, the pine bough centerpiece she'd assembled herself. She had put honest care into how it looked. Then the shepherd's pie came out in its Costco tray set on her good serving dish, the pierogies on a platter, the turkey breast on a cutting board, pre-sliced, the Nanaimo bars arranged on a cake stand with the tray quietly out of sight. Keith ate without complaint. He complimented the centerpiece, which genuinely deserved the compliment. At some point his wife leaned toward Scott and said quietly, "Your parents usually cook, don't they? Are they all right?" Scott said they had a prior commitment they couldn't move, which was true. Amanda, from across the table, said there had been a last-minute change of plans. Also true, depending on your definition of last minute. The two explanations didn't quite line up. The way improvised explanations don't when two people are accounting for the same gap in the story from different angles. Jess had given up on the tourtière and was sitting at the end of the table. At one point, she looked down the table at Amanda and said, quietly but clearly, "You should have asked them properly, Mandy." "Don't start, Jess." Jess didn't start, but she held the look for a moment, the expression of a younger sister who has run past the point of softening things, before she went back to her pierogies. Guests left by 6, earlier than a Christmas dinner usually ends, earlier than it would have ended if someone had been in that kitchen since 6 in the morning, and the house had the warmth that comes from a full day of cooking, the kind that settles into the walls. Keith's first email to Scott in the new year was a routine January note about Q1 project timelines. He did not mention Christmas. That was that. Amanda didn't post any photos to Instagram that evening. She had taken several of the table before the food came out. They stayed on her phone. We flew home December 27th. Toronto gray and cold, the particular low ceiling that Ontario does in winter. Not dramatic enough to be interesting, just heavy enough to remind you immediately why Victoria existed as an idea. The rideshare pulled into our driveway just after 4 in the afternoon. Scott was sitting on our front steps. Not his house. Ours. He'd driven in from Mississauga, 40 minutes at least, without calling ahead. That told me how long he'd been sitting with it. A phone call had felt insufficient, so he hadn't made one. He just came. He stood when I came up the walk. We looked at each other. He had the look of someone who had been honest with himself for the first time in a while and found it cost him sleep. "Amanda didn't come," he said. "Okay," I said. We went inside. Jean had come in ahead of me, and the kettle was already on. The three of us sat at the kitchen table. The same table, the same chairs, the same spots we'd used for his entire life. Scott said. I knew it was too much and I said nothing. I kept telling myself it wasn't worth the argument, that you'd both just come through the way you always did, and I let her treat you and Mom like you'd just always be there. He stopped. That wasn't okay. No, I said, it wasn't. He looked at me. He'd been expecting more scaffolding around the truth, maybe. I didn't have any to offer. Jean put her hand over his on the table. We love you, she said. That's not in question. But we will not be made invisible so someone else can look good, not even for you. I hear you, Scott said. Good, Jean said, and poured the tea. We sat there without filling the silence. It was the kind of quiet that only follows something honest being said and actually received. The quiet on the other side of a real conversation, when everyone in the room has stopped performing. It was the best half hour the three of us had spent together in 2 years. Amanda called January 2nd. She wanted me to know, she said, that what we'd done was hurtful. I told her I understood it felt that way, and I'd ask her to understand that receiving a 12-item catering list and being told the kitchen was all mine was hurtful too. I said we could talk about it honestly or leave it there. Her choice. A silence. She hung up. She called back 4 days later. That call was different. She talked less and asked more. She asked how Victoria was. Said the crab sounded nice. Said she'd been thinking. She didn't apologize in those exact words, but she asked instead of assumed, for the first time in 2 years, and I recognized that as the closest thing to an opening we were going to get. Jean took the second call. They talked for 14 minutes, longer than they'd ever talked, Jean told me afterward, without Amanda issuing her a task. There was no grand resolution, no moment where everyone wept and pledged to be different people. That's not how it works. What changed was more functional than that. An assumption had been removed. The assumption that Jean's time and labor and willingness were simply available, on demand indefinitely. Once that assumption was gone, things had to be discussed, which meant everyone had to behave like people who had actual choices. That was enough. Scott started calling more, asking instead of updating. Small things, but they added up. Jean registered for a watercolor class at the Lakeshore Community Center. Tuesday mornings, 10 to noon. She'd wanted to for 2 years and kept postponing because there was always something someone else needed first. The first Tuesday she went, she came home with a small painting of an inlet, done from memory, Wendy's view, rough around the edges, and exactly right. She propped it on the kitchen windowsill and left it there. We booked Victoria again for the long weekend in May. Wendy was already planning which botanical gardens we'd visit. One Saturday morning in February, I went to the kitchen and made pancakes. Just the two of us, nothing elaborate, real maple syrup from the bottle we'd been working through since October. Jean poured coffee and sat at the counter, and we did not talk about Amanda or Scott or Christmas or any of it. We just had breakfast. I stood at that stove in my green canvas apron with the old stain near the hem, and I thought, this is what it was always supposed to be. The two of us in this kitchen on a Saturday morning with nowhere we had to be. About a week after we got back from Victoria, Jean was reorganizing the hall closet and pulled down a shoebox from the top shelf. My handwriting on the lid, MISC, Photos, 2010s. We brought it to the kitchen table and opened it together. The ordinary archaeology of a shared life. Birthdays, Scott at 12, holding up a fish with entirely too much pride, a Canada Day backyard party we couldn't quite date. Near the bottom, Jean held up a photograph. It was a Christmas from several years back, based on the old kitchen tiles. Before we had the backsplash redone, probably 8 or 9 years ago. She was at the stove. I was standing behind her, my arm loose around her shoulders, my face tilted toward hers. We were both laughing. At what? I couldn't tell you. Something had landed just right and someone had caught it. I didn't remember being photographed, but I remembered the feeling. Being there, not because she'd asked me to be, not because it was required, just because I wanted to be, and because she shouldn't be alone in that kitchen, because she had never once asked me to stand beside her, which made it more important, not less. That was the thing that had very nearly been taken from her. Not the labor, the company, the assumption that she would simply be there, alone, reliable as a light switch, had erased the part of the thing that made it mean anything at all. Jean put the photograph in a small wooden frame and set it on the kitchen shelf beside the Niagara Falls mug. We stood there looking at it for a moment. We should have gone to Victoria years ago, she said. We went when we needed to, I said. She looked at me. That's quite philosophical for a Saturday. I'm a man of depth, John. She laughed. And I thought, that is what the 32 years were for. Not to provide Christmas catering for professional impressions. For this, the two of us in this kitchen, on a Saturday morning with nothing we had to be anywhere for. If you've ever been handed a list when you deserved an invitation, this story is for you. And here's what I want to ask you before you go. Have you ever set a limit that felt like a risk in the moment, but felt immediately right the second you did it? Tell me in the comments. And if someone in your life needs to hear this story today, pass it to them. There are more stories like this one in the description below. We'll see you there.